Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon to talk about the future of crypto regulation. My name is Sarah Milby. I'm head of policy at Blockchain Association. It's a trade association based in Washington, D.C. We represent about 100 companies who are all in the crypto space, basically representing their interests in Washington, D.C. in front of regulators and lawmakers. And I'm joined here today by Kevin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Wysocki with Anchorage Digital. We're a crypto platform that provides custody, staking, trading, settlement, and governance services. We're also known as the first and only federally chartered digital asset bank in the United States, and we recently announced an unhosted wallet called Porto for institutions.
I feel like we'll just dive into the conversation.
Sounds good.
It might be helpful to give a little bit of a landscape of how, to date, the crypto industry has interacted with the government. I think there are three main facets the way that the industry is really trying to put forward a good amount of education. We're trying to highlight use cases, and we're even trying to do a continued engagement by meeting with different staff and members of Congress themselves. I think the most important part of our job is education. This is a very complicated space. I think that people don't really understand blockchain, let alone crypto. So it's our job to try to go in, especially when there's new legislation being crafted, to try to explain what that legislation's effect would be on the industry, particularly through the lens of how the technology works. The other part is use cases. So in part through the education, it's highlighting what use cases would be affected, but it's also, I think, trying to show members of Congress why they need to care about the space. I think right now, a lot of people on the Hill kind of give a shoulder shrug when we talk about crypto and see it as something that bad actors use for nefarious purposes. They see it as like a fraud scheme. They could, connect it with FTX. So it's interesting to see, too, how when we bring really interesting use cases to the light in front of these Congress people, how it can change their minds about their approach to regulating the space. And then the last one is just continued engagement. We're having conversations with the staff and the members themselves, really trying to make sure that when it comes time to vote or write pieces of legislation, that they're in a good position to do so. So I'm curious, Kevin, why you think there hasn't really been any crypto regulation or legislation written to date?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah. Honestly, it's really difficult to move legislation in Congress. Many times it takes many years, 4 to 5 years to move it. And then when you're talking about crypto, you're talking about new technology and a lot of existing laws, whether it's security, banking, illicit finance, that are all part of the conversation here. So members want to get it right. But they also want to make sure that it's going to work for the long term. So I think you've seen a number of bills that have been put out there, and there's been a lot of work done over the last few years, and we're making progress. But there's still more that needs to be done in the near future. Really quickly, I just want to say, 9 years ago when I was on the Hill, I remember a couple of members put together some meetings with industry, and they invite other members to start the education process on blockchain. Now, on Capitol Hill, we have hearings almost every week, sometimes multiple hearings per week. We have multiple digital asset subcommittees in Congress. There is staff exclusively focused on crypto in Congress. Things have really changed, and it's starting to bear fruit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that everyone talks about in DC is clarity, especially when it comes to crypto. Some people wonder whether or not there's already clarity, trying to fit crypto into old laws, trying to figure out new laws in order to kind of bridge the gap in different kinds of jurisdictional issues between agencies like the SEC and CFTC, basically deciding whether a coin is a security or commodity has a lot of ramifications for how it's traded, how it's custodied, et cetera. So I'm curious how you're viewing the future outlook on legislation and what are some things we can see coming down the line?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of major categories for crypto legislation that are being talked about in DC right now. Maybe we could start with SAB 121 today because there was actually a vote in the House Financial Services Committee. And maybe, sir, do you want to talk a little bit more about what that exactly is?
Yeah, so the SEC, which is a securities regulator, basically put out guidance about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And what it does is it changes the accounting of crypto assets that are held and custodied by banks and other institutions and essentially makes them liabilities instead of assets on the balance sheet. This, in essence, just makes it really expensive for banks to custody crypto, and so it creates a disincentive for them to participate in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, there was a vote today. It was a bipartisan vote. All the Republicans voted for it. 3 of the Democrats did. I think later this year, it's very likely that both the House and Senate will vote on that legislation. I think most people think, though, that this particular legislation that repeals SAB 121 will not be enacted into law because the vehicle that's used is something called Congressional Review Act resolution, which is typically used when an outgoing administration issued regulation and then a new administration comes in and the new administration wants to get rid of it with Congress. So this vehicle is considered a bit more partisan, but there is a lot of underlying support for changing SAB 121 and potentially repealing it as well.
And what about market structure? So SAB 121 was voted out of committee today, but there were 2 bills earlier this summer that were also written and then voted out of committee. That's kind of the first step in legislation to going to a floor vote and eventually making its way to the president's desk. So curious what you're thinking about that bill, why it's needed, and what its future is.
Yeah, so market structure reform is huge. There's a need for clarity within the industry about exactly who's regulating digital asset securities, who's regulating digital asset commodities, and there are a whole host of like parallels within traditional finance that if you were to take some of those principles and obligations that these financial institutions have, it arguably would make the system safer and honestly more inviting for people to participate in the marketplace. So that particular bill, it's called the Fit for the 21st Century Act, was passed last year in committee with bipartisan support, and it will likely be on the House floor sometime around March 31st. Now, I have to caveat that there's a lot going on with Congress right now. It's likely that it'll get pushed back a little bit, but I do know it's a priority of the House Republicans to move forward with that bill in the near future.
What do you think the Senate is doing on it?
Well, obviously, there's been a lot of good work in the Senate. Lummis and Gillibrand have their own bill. But I think that particular bill will not get a standalone vote. I think with most of these bills, I think there's going to have to be a big package of crypto, various policy crypto and legislation, or various crypto legislations that are combined together that may pass either later this year, even though there's a low chance, or sometime in the next few years.
It's interesting. There's often pairings in different bills in order to make them more palatable, if you will, for different members of Congress. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen on the Hill is like money laundering and the belief that crypto is being used for illicit finance purposes. Often we talk about a kind of compromise in which people on the Hill really want to pair AML policy with FIT policy, like the Fit for the 21st Century Act, or even stablecoin legislation, because they're quite concerned that criminals are running rampant on blockchains, that they're using it to fund nuclear weapons programs, et cetera. A lot of these conversations, I think, that scare members of Congress are happening behind closed doors with the intelligence community, think CIA, FBI, et cetera. But I do think Congress also learns a lot through headlines, and after Hamas was claimed to have used quite a bit of crypto last fall in October, there was a Wall Street Journal article that came out that's really shifted a lot of the dialogue subsequently in legislation. So I'm curious what legislation you see coming as a result of this kind of headline reading and the kind of scare tactics that might be used in Congress.
Yeah, in the Senate there are 2 prominent bills, DAMLA and CAN-C. Both of those bills are kind of a tone center, I think, in DC right now of like the fact that it's very clear that Congress wants to do something on illicit finance related to crypto. But I also anticipate in the near future that there should be a bipartisan illicit finance bill coming out of the House Financial Services Committee. And then there's also likely to be kind of a Treasury guided bill introduced by leaders in both the Senate and possibly the House, where they ask for, where they grant Treasury maybe some extraterritorial jurisdiction over non-U.S. Stablecoin issuers, and these are stablecoins that are backed by U.S. dollars, and then also giving secondary sanctions or giving them more authority to do more with secondary sanctions. So I think both of these, both the Treasury-led initiative and what's going to happen in the Financial Services Committee, are going to add to the debate to the other bills that are already out there.
What do you think are the misconceptions around AML and crypto that is really being talked about on the Hill?
Well, I think it goes back to some of the education that we were talking about earlier. I think there's a lot of data out there, and when you dive more deeply into the data, it provides a clearer picture as to the extent that the extent of the problem. We're an OCC bank. We are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. We have like over 50 compliance workers at our bank working on all these issues. It's something that I think the industry needs to take very seriously, but it's something it's developing. There are going to be more bills, and I think if any of it's going to get enacted into law, I think it's probably going to have to be paired again with one of these other bills, maybe stablecoin legislation, which we have not yet spoken about.
Yeah, so stablecoins was the other bill besides the Fit for the 21st Century Act that was passed out of the committee, the Financial Services Committee, last July. And essentially what it does is it sets up a framework for the federal government and state governments to allow different companies to issue stablecoins. Those that are backed by reserves usually will be custodied in banks. So it doesn't touch anything like DAI, like a decentralized stablecoin. It's really focused on centralized issuers and giving them different options and pathways to create a federal framework and not go state by state and collect licenses. And hopefully that, if you're in Iowa and you're compliant in Iowa, that if you're using the same stablecoin in New Jersey, that you don't have to worry about a whole nother set of regulations, obtaining a second license. It's just a tedious task to do all 50 states. So hopefully this will provide a better pathway, and I'm curious what you think the chances are of it passing this year.
Yeah, so this is something that the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters, and then the chairman, Patrick McHenry, have been working on for the last 2 years. They marked up a bill last July. It didn't get as much bipartisan support as originally anticipated. They've been working on this bill since then. Ranking Member Waters has said that they're getting closer. Secretary Yellen has said that she would like to see a stablecoin bill. I think this is probably the best candidate to be paired with maybe illicit finance legislation to move in the near future. There are still differences between Republicans and Democrats over the state and federal pathways for issuers of stablecoins. But I don't think those differences are insurmountable.
The upcoming election, do you think that will play into the success, like potential success of the bill?
So I actually think that regardless of who's in the White House, you're going to have bipartisan support for legislation. I know some people might say, well, what happens if like Republicans control the presidency, the Senate, and the House, or Democrats do? I think what you really need to move any legislation you want as a party in Congress is you need those three things, but you need a supermajority in the Senate, which is 60 votes. And I think it's highly unlikely, almost impossible for any party to get that and also have the majority in the House and the White House. So you're going to need at least probably 5 or 6 minority members of the Senate to vote for crypto legislation. So I don't necessarily think for legislation that a different president really changes anything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious how you're thinking about if there's a divided Congress or not. So I don't know if you want to explain what a divided Congress is and what it means for, you somewhat explained what it means for legislation, but just elaborate on that for the audience.
Yeah, a divided Congress is when like you have like the Senate and it's controlled by one party and then the House is controlled by another party. You could just say divided government in general, and you would mean that like the White House is one party and there's at least one other party controlling one of the other chambers of Congress. And I personally think that it is true that there are a number of Democrats and Republicans that want to see more clarity in this space. Whether it's the chairman of the Banking Committee, who's a Democrat, whether it's the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, which is a Republican, their staff and these members are working hard on this.
So we've talked a lot about a few bills that, of anything that's most likely to happen. It's the repeal of SAB 121, stablecoins, illicit finance, and market structure with FIT. What one are you most excited about? Or is there some new legislation that you think is really needed that no one's really discussing yet?
You know, I talked a lot about illicit finance earlier and the potential for these new bills coming. I think that's something that the audience would be interested in because there are ramifications potentially for DeFi, for unhosted wallets, for infrastructure, and how that debate over illicit finance plays out could have ramifications for all the people that are here today talking about the great things that they're building.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern on the illicit finance front for sure. One thing I'm really excited about, and it's not the most sexy topic, but it's tax. I think tax is really important in our space, especially because crypto right now is treated as property. And for that reason, anytime you're switching coins, technically you're supposed to be taxed on the transaction and keep track of what price you bought that coin at, what price you exchanged it at or sold it for. And I think right now, there's a lot of questions in tax on what's the best way to report your taxes, why is it so difficult, et cetera. And I think Congress can do a lot to step up there. I'm just curious what other thoughts you have for developers in particular and how they should be thinking about what's happening in DC as they start to build or think about creative new ideas.
Yeah, I would say another policy area that's quite fascinating that has huge implications that I think developers should think about are everything with stablecoins. The ability of stablecoins to potentially export U.S. dollars throughout the world is huge, and I think people at the highest levels of our government, whether it's the Federal Reserve, Treasury, White House, are thinking through all the implications of that. So any projects associated with that, I think, is of particular interest to the government right now, because controlling the U.S. money supply is something that the government obviously cares a whole lot about. Did you have anything else you want to say for the developers?
Well, I'm curious on stablecoins. There are a lot of other countries that are working on it. I'm curious how you think the U.S. is positioned just generally in legislation and thinking about crypto compared to some foreign jurisdictions.
Yeah, good question. I think you could definitely argue that we're behind some of the other countries on stablecoin legislation. However, I think it's really important that we get it right. That's the most important thing. And I think because our leaders in Congress have already done so much work on this and we are that close, I don't think it's going to hurt us so long as we, in the next couple of years, can get a stablecoin bill through Congress.
That makes a lot of sense. If you were a developer, what would you say is the one agency you might not know about that you should know about?
That's a good question. Everyone in the government is talking about crypto. The IRS hired 2 people just the other day that are focusing on crypto. So you would be surprised. Then there are blockchain projects going on throughout the government. But yeah, it can be anyone from the IRS to the National Economic Council, the Oversight Committee in Congress. There are a lot of people engaged in government on this now.
It's funny, every once in a while a new agency comes out of the woodwork that I'd never heard of before, and I feel like I've been in DC for a while and we've seen them all, but recently the EIA, which is a part of the Department of Energy, basically is a collection of data. It's that's what its main purpose is. They put out a request for all Bitcoin miners to submit information about their energy use, et cetera. And it's just interesting how every part of the government, to your point, is starting to think about crypto. So I know we're almost out of time. I'm curious for what you think will happen in 5 years.
I think all the bills that were just mentioned, I think some form of them will be enacted. We'll have much more clarity, and I think the United States will be in a very good position for all the financial innovation and technological innovation that is being worked on here at ETHDenver and talked about.
Amazing. Well, I think that concludes our panel. Really appreciate everyone for coming here today, and feel free to ask us questions afterwards.